have taken over this channel, and as we continue to guide you through the lands of night, you might discover the old place of the earth has its own guardians. Campsite by StoryMan-Jack. Will slapped his brother Jim on the shoulder as they went through the equipment in the back of the old Jeep. "Ryan, you bringing that cooking equipment?" "Got ya," the friend, become business partner, told them. "Just think," he told them, "we finally made it to the point where the team can run the operation without us." "Don't I know it," Jim agreed. "We haven't been up to the land in a long time. I'll bet it's feeling neglected," he laughed. "I don't care," Will said. "Either way, let's saddle up, gents, and get going." They finished up the packing and double-checked that everything was secure before they jumped into the old CJ7. "How far out to this place?" Ryan asked the brothers. "Only about 2 hours up in the mountains," Jim said, while his brother nodded. "Yeah, it's been in the family since before there was a state here," Will added. "Well, that's interesting. I've never been outside the city," Ryan admitted. "Is there a cabin up there or something?" Jim laughed. "Not much of nothing up there. Just a good camping spot, a stream to fish in, and plenty of game to hunt. And lots of trees. Hell of a lot of trees," Will teased, chuckling. The trio found themselves setting up tents on a large pad atop the small rise in a tiny clearing. There was just enough room for the 3 one-man tents to parse themselves around a small campfire. Ryan was sweating before he even got the chance to start working on setting up his tent. "Damn," he said, his voice harsh as he tried to catch his breath. "You guys ever think to have a drive cut at least halfway up here? Jeez." The brothers laughed. "Nah," Will said. "We're taught from a very young age that this land has to stay pretty much pristine." "Why?" Ryan asked, sitting down on a log that had long since been pulled up to serve as a bench. "Oh, there are treaties and federal agreements involved," Jim told him soberly. "We're in the middle of a national forest, after all. We own the land, but the original agreement to keep care for it that was established by our ancestor was with the local native tribe." Will nodded as he finished up his own tent. "Yeah, we lease the land to the feds in order to allow it to be part of the national forest. That way we don't get taxed, and we can use this anytime we want." "Wow, how big is it?" Ron asked, looking out into the afternoon light filtered through the old tall trees. "Oh, about 1,100 acres, Jim said. "Big enough for camping, hunting, and fishing anyway." He paused and looked at his friend's tent. "Still, your tent's in the packaging. You need some help?" "Yeah, I think so," Ron said, laughing. "Then maybe it's beer time." Sounds good to me," Jim exclaimed and hid the beer he had already tapped behind his back. They all laughed. Ryan Jones woke later that night, his bladder full. The darkness was deeper than any he could ever remember seeing, having never been away from a population center. He looked at his wrist and cursed under his breath that his watch was dead. His phone had no signal, but it said it was about a quarter until 2 in the morning. After unzipping and exiting his tent, he listened to the silence in the darkness broken only by the low glowing coals in the fire pit. He heard both Jim and Will snoring in their own respective tents. Using the flashlight function on his phone, Ryan made his way barefooted to where they had dug a pit in order to take care of their bodily functions. "Bury that shit after you're done," Will told him. "We got this pit deep enough that you can just shovel dirt over it to keep it from calling in the wild animals who'll think of you as nothing more than food, brother." "Yeah," he nodded. "I'd imagine that's also why it's so far away from the campsite. What, 100 yards or so?" "You got it," Jim laughed. "Keep that shit as far away from my bed as you can." He crunched on bare feet through the undergrowth, pine needles and twigs. "Should have thrown my shoes on," he said to himself in regret. Snap! Something sounded from behind him. He swung his light around to find nothing. He couldn't tell how far away the sound came in the gloom. For all he knew, it was low burning coals popping in the distance as they spent their fuel. A few more steps down the little-used trail, and he heard something else. almost so faint that he initially disregarded it as his imagination, for he couldn't quite catch the words or their meanings. It was like a murmur, a memory of a memory whispered in the wind, but it was definitely two different voices he was hearing. Ryan almost called out, but he'd remembered the dire warnings of his friends. If you think there's something out there, act as if there is. A bear or mountain lion or something stalking will pounce if you make sudden yells or movements in the night. Waiting, he heard the sounds, as if he were in the park back home. He'd think it were other campers off in the distance, their voices temporarily carried to him by a trick of the wind through the trees. So he made his way toward the pit, where he's supposed to do his business. He gained only a few more yards when he heard something big behind him, a crash, something larger than just a little snap or pop of the fire. He spun around, ready to run for his life, light in hand, to find nothing. Absolutely nothing. And the forest, suddenly even more silent than it had been. He'd noticed for the first time that he wasn't hearing instead of what he was. When he had started and opened his tent, there were many sounds. The chirping of insects, if nothing else. The constant buzz in the background of the forest. Mixed together with that buzz was the low hum of the night breeze shifting in the wind, and occasionally those breezes loud enough to sound off creaks and snaps in the limbs of the high canopy above. Also, the distant calls of night birds echoed lightly in that mixture of sound. Yet now, after the crashing sound, there was nothing of that background noise that he had filtered out earlier in the night. Not one thing was in hearing, almost as if he'd gone deaf, though his straining ears did hear the soft groaning of the breeze again through the trees, only silent for but an instant. The insects and birds, that there was not a chirp or a peep. Turning around once again to continue on to the place he'd been told to relieve himself, he lost time. Suddenly and without warning, his turn back toward the vastness of the deep night forest, he came face to face with a horror with the melted waxy features of a statue melting in a fire. When he came back to himself, he realized he'd no longer need the use of the pit to relieve himself, his cargo shorts soaked and stinking with his urine. The creature stood before him, drool falling down its ruined face, features undulating even as it stepped forward to take hold of him with melting and writhing clawed hands. Ryan spun again as if to run for the camp, but another such creature stood almost on top of him. Again, the night quiet as he felt the blow to the back of his head and the blackness that took him. He woke on a stone altar, one that seemed to be so old that it was part of the mountain itself. The two ghoulish beings stood on either side of him as he tested the leather bonds that held him. But they were so tight, he couldn't even flex his numb hands or his tingling feet. He knew the circulation was gone. They'd soaked the leather in water before tying him up, and as it shrank, it fastened him like a lock and chain. The gurgling voices that addressed him from either side of the altar sounded haltingly familiar. "Be quiet," it slurred. "If you are calm, this will be over in moments, and you will feel nothing." "Oh," the other slurred, "you can struggle and pray for what you've done before you're given." "Given? Pay? For what? What do you think I've done?" he asked, not understanding what these creatures even were. "You stole, you took, embezzled," the voice drew out like a hiss, "from our company, from our livelihood." The other voice gurgled in a chuckle. and so convenient. Since it is awakened, it must feed, must have blood once again. The mountain rumbled. Will? He asked hauntingly, finally understanding. Jim? No, you don't understand. I didn't embezzle anything. I promise. I did no such thing. The voice, Ryan could no longer tell which creatures was which, spoke. It matters not. It's too late he comes. Indeed, the mountain shook again and again until a shadowy figure stood before him, collar round its neck. It looked like what some would have called Bigfoot or Sasquatch, only it was like 15 feet tall. The land wakes, the brothers chanted in unison. The land hungers. Ryan screamed, Don't do this, oh my God. We must, they said in unison, their voices blended together now as one. That was the contract, the treaty. We are to feed the land, and our fortunes tied to it will increase, and it must feed. And the last thing Ryan saw before the lights went out was the pendant around the creature's throat, the one in the shape of a coal-black goose with a red stripe at its neck and blood-dipped wingtips. And so another is lost, food for a dark being, for their power is in sacrifice. For those creatures in the night, in the dark. Nox Veni, fear the night.